I had a chance to join this music group that had a record deal on the table in Europe. At that point, for what I was doing, it was like, "Oh my gosh, this is an amazing opportunity," and so, like, I started rehearsing with them, and the plane tickets were bought to go to London, and I got my first passport, and then somewhere in the process of the rehearsals and looking at the contract with them before we had left on the trip, I remember walking into our kitchen one day and telling my parents I'm not supposed to do it.
Mm.
Like, with tears in my eyes at that point, because 'cause I'm a 16-year-old who wants to do music, and on the surface, this was the dream, it was a record deal, it was international, it was still Christian music, but I just knew that God was telling me that that's not what he had for me.
She's been a major force in Christian music, particularly in music aimed at kids and families. She's a Dove Award winning songwriter and artist, and I'm super stoked to welcome Yancey to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
I wanted to just introduce folks to you and your story. If you don't mind, I'd love to just start from the beginning and hear maybe about, the early years where you grew up, like how you begin to think maybe you would want to do music when you grew up, all that stuff.
As far back as I can remember, of course, my parents told me a story about me performing with my Mr. Microphone toy on the fireplace hearth, in our living room. I don't exactly remember that, but at the point in my story that I do remember, I lived in Montgomery, Alabama. I was still single digits. And I mean, starting around, literally probably 7 years old or so, just kind of fell in love with music. I was taking some piano lessons, but I literally remember like we had a kids worship team in our children's church, and my dad was the children's pastor. So I was hanging out with him on Saturdays, and they had this little worship team practice, and like someone that was on the team and scheduled didn't show up for practice that day. And so somehow I volunteered myself, to be a part of that. And then literally it's like never looked back, like started singing offertory specials and, singing the kids
Mm.
choir. Singing Awesome God when that was like a brand new song, late 80s. So from that point though, I think there was an understanding and a knowing inside of me that God had put me on this earth to do music. And so everything in my life just kind of
Oh.
started focusing around that. And, I would sing in my room every day to all the Amy Grant songs and, everything else and just practice my songs and performing those. And we moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma right when I turned 10 years old. And that as well was like a shifting point for me because I started taking piano from someone who was Carmen's music director back when that was a really big deal to say, like, it was the height of his career at that point. But I started taking piano lessons from Willie Davis is his name, and it's just, like, looking back on it, you start realizing you're like, "Wow, the adults in my life, they knew." They knew something was on my life and that there was something the Lord had called me to do, and you just start to have the clarity of just how meaningful every one of those conversations with an adult leader at church was, cheering me on when I had performed, what was not like a Grammy-winning performance or whatever, but
And what age was this?
literally, like, between 10 and 15 years old.
And even younger than that, were there signs that you had like a communication gift or?
It was just like falling in love with music and just kind of like that was my thing. My piano teacher, he was preparing me for big and great things literally from the beginning. It was like a few months in, he like had me playing in the worship band in our children's ministry that we had. I'm confident there's no way I could have been ready for that, but it was one of those things. I was one of those people, like, you set the bar and I'll rise to it, and I feel like Willie was very good about giving me an opportunity and calling me to something, and then I would work really hard to be able to carry that. So, those 5 years then were just being involved in every worship team possible at church and singing every special offertory at church I possibly could. And then my youth pastor who was he was musically influenced. I will say that about him. So he leaned on a musical side of things compared to some youth pastors that are out there. We had attended a concert in our town, and while we were at that concert, just a group of us from the church, God just put it in my youth pastor's heart, and he said, "You know what Yancey wants to do. How can you help her take a next step?" And so we planned several months down the road that I there was a Wednesday night, and I was gonna do a concert. Like, I laugh now because it was a 30-minute concert, which is, like, not a big deal, but when you've only ever sang single songs, and for the first time, you now needed to sing, like, 6 or 7 songs and talk, you know, between the songs and, do some other things besides just sing your song and walk off the stage. It was a big deal. So that was certainly like a hugely timeline there in the sand because that's kind of what made me like share the songs that I had written in my room that no one, even my family, had not heard, because I was so secretive about it. So, like doing that first concert kind of like made me bring my songs to the table and Willie tweaked those. And we then like recorded my first little 2-song demo and all of that.
So you said you were secretive. Were you, like, shy?
I think I was shy as a songwriter. Like I wasn't shy as a singer and a performer, but I was
But your
shy.
songs
I
were
was
sacred.
shy yeah, I was shy as a songwriter.
Yeah.
It was like, no, no one could hear this.
Mhm.
But I mean, I would say that like I love to be on stage, but yet when I'm in my room every day practicing my songs, if my mom came to the door to like tell me something or whatever, I would stop whatever I was doing. Like the song couldn't continue that I was playing or whatever. So I think it was like the imaginary stage that was happening there in my bedroom behind the closed doors was kind of like, well, you're not ready to see that. But yet if I was like singing at church, I wouldn't have been shy about it. Anyway, so that was when I was 15 years old. I did the first concert. And then really like we made a 2-song demo, that was on cassette and a little O sleeve, the whole bit. And then I started like traveling around to some other youth groups kind of in our area within a couple hours and doing other 30-minute concerts and all of that. So interesting. I had a chance about a year after that to join this music group that had a record deal on the table in Europe. It was much more like dance music, where there's a little bit of rap, there's tons of choreography. It's a 4-person group, and I would be like the singer girl that's carrying the chorus hook of the song that's probably rapped or whatever for the rest of it. And, at that point, for what I was doing, it was like, "Oh my gosh, this is an amazing opportunity," and so, like, I started rehearsing with them, and the plane tickets were bought to go to London, and I got my first passport, and then somewhere in the process of the rehearsals and looking at the contract with them before we had left on the trip, I remember walking into our kitchen one day and telling my parents I'm not supposed to do it.
Mhm.
Like, with tears in my eyes at that point, because 'cause I'm a 16-year-old who wants to do music, and on the surface, this was the dream, it was a record deal, it was international, it was still Christian music, but I just knew that God was telling me that that's not what he had for me, and so I bailed, and I didn't go on the trip. I joke that God still owes me a trip to London, but I think looking, because it's true, I've only been in the London airport, but I've never been outside into the city, so I'm like, God owes me a good trip to London. But I think, like, reflecting on it, I was doing this interview a couple years ago in the middle of COVID stuff, and I think I was able to tie together what the obedience of that moment represented, I think was significant, and then everything else that's come in these years since. So, I just, went back to doing my little regional youth groups and being a part of different Christian little radio stuff that was happening. We had this kind of more like indie Christian rock radio station that was happening in our town at that point, and they would do all these little pop-up events
Mm.
around town. And then I had an opportunity to make my first record when I was 17 here in Nashville. And I'll say in there too, The Gospel Music Association at the time did these like conferences for independent artists and songwriters. Tied to that and the competition that they had is what Jars of Clay won before the world knew them, and their significance as Jars of Clay. And Nicole Nordeman had won that on the songwriting side of things. They were the two most famous
That's
winners
awesome.
of it ever. So I had gone to that and just learned so much because you were literally were sitting there with A&R guys and, working with Tom Jackson as a performance consultant and having your songs critiqued, by whatever guest artist was in that city and other people that worked at word publishing, and I met a ton of people here in Nashville through that. I'll give this little piece of advice to those that are listening. I went to more than once, like, I literally went to these, like, 3 times, and the fact that I came back helped me build rapport with the faculty, that were all real working people in the industry because they knew I was serious. Because so many people go one time, they get their song critiqued, and then they quit, fall off the face of the earth, like, whatever they do, they don't ever show back up. And so, I mean, I would have some of these guys tell me, like, "I don't mind sitting here talking to you on what, should be their break in the afternoon or
Mhm.
whatever, because I know you came back, so I know you're serious." So I ended up winning that final competition in '99, which is also so funny because at that point, I was talking very, very seriously with Benson Records, and they were going through this label head change at the time. But it was one of those moments where, like, everyone in town knew, like, Yancey wins the competition, it's a shoo-in, the deal's done, and there's just as
Wow.
chatter from other labels and whatever. I won the competition, and then the new label head decided not to sign me, which, of course,
Oh,
was, like, earth-shattering in the moment, but, like, now looking back on it, it's very much like, "Thank you. I'm so glad that you did it," because I also realized I was able to meet with a ton of A&R guys and, have deals on the table, some deals that I turned down, some deals that we were seeking out, but if I'd gone down those paths, I would have never arrived at doing what I'm doing now, and so I'm able to see, like, God's protection and God's guidance on me where it was, oh, so close so many times because I think all of those things made me a better artist and a stronger artist and songwriter and just developing my gift and building relationships in this town. At the same time, it was like that wasn't what God had put me on this earth to do. And if I'd walked through some of those doors, I might not be doing music anymore and could be the one that has the job working at Starbucks or, selling real estate or doing whatever non-music thing. I'm just so thankful that all parties involved listening to God's voice because those are the things that enabled me to get to this point in the story. So,
you said the phrase, "Not what I was put on earth to do." So before we get to that, just diving more into, I guess, even where your head was at this time. I mean, you mentioned it was earth-shattering to be rejected from that record deal. Like, was that a moment where you were just like, "Well, I guess I'm gonna go back to school, or I guess I'm gonna go to, work at Starbucks, and I'll just pursue a whole different path?" Or were you just like, was it more resolve? Like, "No, no one can tell me no, I'm doing this."
part of why I say it was earth-shattering in that moment is I had spent the previous 6 months so, I had this relationship with an A&R guy, where we had been coming back and forth to town, we had been recording demos, doing all the
Mhm.
things. In some ways, that relationship that I had with that A&R guy, that now when he called and said the new president of the label said no and wasn't gonna move forward with it, it was sad because you realize this is the end of our relationship. I was signing up and, like, ready to, like, be doing life and collaborating and all of these things, and so it's a
Mhm.
little bit like dating someone, We can be friends, but, it's not gonna be this, like, working relationship that we kind of had thought, so and then I guess even, like, shortly after that, though, on the flip side of things, I had it was a newer label at the time that has ended up signing some people that were all very successful, But in building that relationship with them, we finally got things to a certain point when the contract was on the table and they wanted a solo artist, but they wanted me to be an all-girl band. And so then all of a sudden, the decision was to move forward with this contract meant even though business-wise it was about me, at the end of the day, I'm the boss and I'm the final say, and these are all just hired guns to be in the photo and be on stage with me. But that resulted in me really having to pray and follow my gut instinct as well as to just who I was, who I am was supposed to be.
Mm.
I had known about that happening in some other situations before and knew some parties involved, and that it was also pretty hurtful to some of those band members, the fakeness of that arrangement. And I'm not ashamed to say that same label ended up going and signing Barlow Girl, which was very successful. You know, it was an all-girl band and they had radio hits and the whole thing, but I knew in my heart of hearts that that wasn't what I was supposed to do. It's so important for you to figure out who you are as an artist, as a songwriter, as a human being, and stay true to that and not be afraid to even let what could be good things and great opportunities to actually walk away from those because to do them, you would be selling out, caving, and leaning into something that maybe at the end of the day wasn't God's divine plan for your life.
Back to quote unquote, what I was put on this earth to do. What was the journey towards that realization?
I started so because I've spent the past, like, 14 years officially being focused on kids and families. A little bit of backstory there, I'm a preacher's kid, my dad has always done children's ministry, so it was certainly something I grew up all around. I can also say never once in a million years was there ever a family conversation where it was like, "Hey, Yancy, have you thought about taking the music thing and the children's ministry thing and mixing them together?" Like, honestly speaking, none of us were that clever. I think you look back on it and you're just like, God is really smart. He's the one that's clever. So there was definitely like a transition there for a number of years. This particular point in the journey, I'd also gotten a really big cut that Avalon had recorded, took to radio. It was number one for 5 weeks. It was on both their greatest hits albums, the Wow Hits record for that year. A song did everything a song can do in AC Christian radio that I had written. And so that was really huge. And around this time, my church there in Tulsa, Oklahoma had built this new youth facility that was like really big. And moving in that, they were going to change a few things about how some of the services were done. And so they wanted there to be these two different worship leaders between middle school and high school. And so they brought me in where it was like, "Hey, you do your music thing the rest of the time, but if you can just contract for us Wednesday nights to be here, lead worship for the middle school." And I was getting married around the same time, so it was also just like that little bit of like, "Okay, well, this is like some concrete funds, that I know are always gonna be there
Sure.
if I show up and do this service." And so it was like every 6 months or so, then they ended up adding something else to my plate. I did the middle school for a while, and then they were like, "Actually, the other person ended up doing something different." They're like, "You take high school." And then a few months later, it was like, "Okay, we're gonna start this young adult service, like, you oversee worship for that as well." And then ended up helping lead adult worship. And so what started off as this like contract labor 1 day a week gig ended up snowballing into a very full-time job for 2 years that I was on staff at the church. And so in those years is when I wrote those worship devotionals that you spoke about, because it was just something like I needed to help my team that I was leading, who was a ton of, teenagers and young adult students that were
Yeah.
punks and, had a talent and a skill, but needed their heart shaped. And I wrote those in that season of life and still coming to Nashville some and still traveling some. But, like as things go, like as the church gig kept growing and was a full-time job, like, even though on paper I was still supposed to be doing my music thing, I had no time and energy left. And in this same span of few years, I had started writing the theme camp for, an elementary summer camp program that our church ran. And so it was just kind of like they needed someone to write the song, and it was like, "Who do we know that writes songs?" "Oh, Yancey." So then it was like, "Write us a camp theme song." I kinda jokingly say it was some easy yeses that God gave me because it was just like, write a song for kids that's gonna get used for 3 months and then really is gonna be shelved. And outside of those people that went to camp, the rest of the world isn't gonna end up experiencing this song. So I did that for a number of years, also sang on a couple, kids projects for some friends of mine in Atlanta, what's now known as the Orange Organization with Reggie Joiner. You fast forward a few years and it was like, "Hey, there's 5 masters that's sitting there, and there's 2 masters in Atlanta. I bet I could get master use permission from these guys, record about 5 more songs for kids, make a kids album." And at this point, like, I still was not thinking this is a career choice or a career move. It was just more so like, I know tons of kids ministry people. I had opportunities to connect with other churches that could use this stuff. So I made an album in 2006 called Loud and Clear, kind of utilizing all those masters and recording a few more. And my dad told me, he was like, "Don't be surprised if you sell more of this than anything else you've done." At that point, it would have almost been like an insulting statement, like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, but, I mean, the response to it was really good, and then the next year was 2007, and just there was a lot of stuff that kind of happened in life, and it resulted in me going back on the road to do music, and at that point, I was involved in music for kids, students, adults, like, so many
Mm,
things. Also say the last thing I did working at the church was actually make what is the first Little Praise Party album of mine, which was, like,
mm,
us making songs for preschool kids to use in our church classrooms, and so, the most recent thing I'd then done was, like, make this preschool record, again, for them. I wasn't making it for me. It was a deciding point too because I knew like, okay, I'm gonna go back to doing music full time, but like I can't say I do music from preschool to adults. That's too broad of a span. So I'm gonna have to figure this out. And really, it was just kind of a series of walking some things out for a number of months. And just really like it came down to I had random people, friends of my dad's, different people calling me up and asking me to do a preteen event or to do some like family kids event at their church. And so you start walking through enough of those doors. And even at the time, I was that school year working with an organization called CIY, Christ in Youth. I was leading worship for their Superstart preteen tour. And I was also on the Believe tour, which was for middle schoolers that year. And both were fun, and that's a whole God story in and of itself that I was able to do both tours that year. I had a great time doing the middle school one, but it was easy to see at the end of the day that I was connecting best with the preteen audience. I was selling more CDs at the event. There was just everything spiritual and physical and the natural was bearing more fruit. And as well, like, then we're getting into that life cycle of the record. I'd made the kids record in 2006, and it was kinda getting to that point of like, well, if I'm gonna do this, like, I need to start thinking about the follow-up and make another one. So
right.
kind of all of these decisions kinda came around the same time, and I think I was just able to see, like, God was shining a light on doing what
Right.
I was doing with preteens and families and all of that. And so then it was I mean, it wasn't even like a "Thus saith the Lord" moment and just like a, "Yancey, this is specifically what I want you to do." It was really me looking around at all the things that I was a part of and that were happening and just kinda going, "Alright, I can connect the dots myself and see here what God has opened up doors for me to do, and also see the places that it's most connecting and lives are being
Mhm.
impacted in a greater way. So by the start of 2008, that's when it's like I knew like, okay, this is what I need to be focusing on. For the first time ever, the pieces of the previous 11 plus years of my journey, like, finally all made sense.
That's amazing. Well, I have a couple of questions just from this era before we move on, this season of your life. And the first one is just you mentioned you were just a PK kid. For those of you out there wondering what that means, it just means pastor's kid. We live in a time right now where it just seems to me like every other conversation I'm having with a Christian, they're going through like a crisis of faith. Maybe it's because just biblical illiteracy in general or stress and anxiety coming from the cultural climate. It's so many different things. But did you ever go through a time having grown up kind of behind the curtain, so to speak, where you went through a disillusionment with the church?
I can certainly say no to ever having something about questioning my faith or all the words that we could use that are popular words to say about that. I think a huge part of that for me was I knew on the inside why God had put me on this earth. I knew there was a call of God on my life and there was things I cared about and wanted to be a part of that as well dictated the walk with Christ I needed to have in order to
Mm,
enable those things to happen. Again, in some ways it was a protection, kind of like the anointing oil concept when the sheep, if you've ever heard that, and them pouring the oil down, how that lubricated and protected the sheep from all the varmints and things that could have attacked them. There was this oil of protection, I think, around me because of what I knew I was stewarding and what I was carrying. And so that just dictated a lot of other choices in my life. But, certainly I've experienced Christians making bad choices as a result of what I went through. And part of this was what happened in 2007. It was just a exodus that had nothing to do with me, but it had to do with my DNA in our church. And it was painful and it was hard. And it was, literally like pouring salt in an open wound, sort of a just thing. Out of that season of life and stuff, too, I came to the realization and I came to the conclusion that God is always good, even when his people aren't. And my perception of God's goodness in my life has to be based on the things that he's doing. It can't be based on the things that I see Christians doing or not doing. And just realizing that the
yeah.
hurtful things that I might have been victim of by a group of people, none of those things had anything to do with the character of God. Interesting enough, like in this season when it was all fresh and it was hard and it was, still raw and you were walking through it, on a couple different occasions, I had dinner with some friends of mine that were people I grew up with, and they both had their own story of stuff that had happened to them. They both still to this day aren't really following the Lord and really weren't in the season that we're having this conversation. And they both came back to me after we had gone to dinner and they just said, "I'm so impressed that you were able to not let what happened shake your faith." And I
Yeah.
was just like, I had no other like, my faith was all I had left. I wasn't gonna jump
Yeah.
I wasn't gonna jump ship because I would have had nothing. I would have literally been in the ocean off the Titanic with not even a wooden raft to hold on to, like, it was also interesting and telling that both of those people, that's what stuck out to them and just hearing my story and hearing where I was. And I think was the difference of how they reacted to what happened and how I did was you gotta remember God is always good even when his people are.
Another question that kind of came out of that season is, I was kind of like struck by, I guess, the self awareness and the ingenuity and the innovation. Maybe even a better word is flexibility. Your flexibility to have a plan for your future and career, and yet kind of be sensitive to the practical needs and opportunities and the things that just by serving what you were around in the moment kind of was a step in figuring out that future. How important is that skill or trait for people in music?
I lean towards saying that it very well could be from the standpoint that I have ended up being an independent artist for my whole career. I think that probably has enabled me and also made a necessity be for me to be flexible and be creative to find ways to keep my ship in the ocean and on a path, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
Because if I had had the major label deal, that actually would have tied my hands on many occasion from doing some other things that didn't fit exactly what they had signed me to do.
There's a strategy part to what you're saying, and yet, being someone who served in local church ministry for 15 years, I remember there was a time when I was signed to an indie label and doing kind of the solo thing myself and traveling and touring and doing the circuit, and in my head, it was separate. It was like, well, I've got Sam, the solo artist who writes songs for people, and then I've got these 600 people every week in the walls of the church, and it seemed like, listening to your story, that you didn't necessarily separate those 2. You were willing to use your quote unquote dream or your passion to serve the people right in front of you. And it seems
Yeah.
like that became a step towards discovering the quote unquote calling.
Yeah, I need to share this story because it is significant. Honestly, I spent a decade not connecting the dots and seeing it until finally a few years back, the Lord was like, "You remember this?" So I made that first kids album in 2006. And then a few months later, I actually had vocal problems that summer and was missing like the top 4 or 5 notes in my register. Just sounded like if you ever sit on a piano and, you just hear that like horrible chaos of notes all happening at the same time. That's what it would sound like if I tried to use one of those notes up there. And, literally like I had sang on Sunday, everything was good. And then it was a Monday and I was in my office and went to like write this chart and was just kind of like, that's weird. That's not working like it should. So
Hmm.
I ended up, doing what any good church worship leader would do of just lowering the keys of all the songs and kept singing on it for about a month in the range that I had left. And then I finally wisely got my vocal coach here in Nashville involved, and she sent me to an ENT and they did a scope, and I had swollen vocal cords which scared the pooey out of me because at this point, Mark Stewart from Audio Adrenaline already had just stopped being the lead singer because he had swollen vocal cords. And so I'm like, he can't even do music, like
Right.
this is scary. This is big. So, anyways, they put me on vocal rest for a month of no singing. And then I would do as many hours in a row as I could every week, which would pretty much probably end up being about 36, 40 hours of no speaking at all. When I would go to church, I couldn't participate in praise and worship, but I was like, well, I'm not just going to stand here. So I'll lip sync. But anytime the word sing or my song or something was, like, in a lyric of the song that we were singing, like, my eyes would just well up with tears, and I would remember praying in those moments, just like, "Oh, God, like, I wanna sing for you," because at this point, I didn't know if I was ever gonna be singing for the rest of my life. And when was said and done, life was good, my voice was healed, and it was about 9 months after that point that everything changed and my world as I knew it shifted, and I had to make some of these new decisions that led me into deciding, "Let's do kids and families," like, that's what God wants me to do. And so I spent a lot of years saying that what happened to me was nothing I ever asked for as far as that shift and that change that happened with my church. And one day, just
Mm.
God kind of dropped that little revelation to me, and he was like, "No, those prayers that you prayed in that month that you couldn't sing, that was me making myself available to him to do kids and families." What I said was nothing I ever asked for, actually was a necessary exodus to get me to my promised land, and it was something I
Mm.
prayed for. I just didn't know it in the moment.
I wanna ask you this. I mean, you mentioned the number 1 song by Avalon, and I read somewhere that you wrote the song "Something Beautiful" by Jackie Velasquez and
Yeah,
many other things. So,
yeah.
obviously, a legit songwriter. Was there ever a season you thought of just being a signed songwriter, or had you always aspired to be an artist and songwriter?
I think artists, I mean, I would be much more comfortable at this point in my story of just being a songwriter than I ever would have been back then. Back then, it was all
Mhm.
about getting me on stage, me, the one with the microphone in my hand, me, the one standing in front of an audience. And I think even over these past years of doing kids' music, one of my greatest joys in life now is the fact that I have so many churches, around America and throughout the world that use videos I've made with recordings, still playing my voice along with it on Sunday morning in their classroom. And I see, videos they post on social media sometimes. And,
Mhm.
sometimes I'm even caught off guard when I press play and I hear me instead of them using the track and having their own vocalist. But every time I do, it's just one of those moments where it's like, I get to be a part of leading those kids and being a part of what that local church is doing from afar, even though I may never meet any person involved face to face. I'm excited for the day that I get to heaven and meet so many people that I've never been in the same room with, but my music
Mhm.
was a part of their relationship with the Lord.
You're literally impacting the lives of people for the rest of their lives because 'cause you're pouring the concrete for the next generation of their faith.
It's so interesting because I make music for a lot of ages, but most of my social media comments are messages from a mom or a grandparent are for, like, kids under 5 years old. I mean, that's also so sweet and so precious. And, I mean, literally, like, in the past month, I got a message from this girl who's in college now. She was, like, a super fan when she was preteen, and I remember her growing up, but her message was like, "I don't know if you'll remember me," which I was like, "Of course I remember you," because she was a big fan. But she was like, "Hey, I'm sitting in the Mayo Clinic right now, and I've got a bunch of pretty hard tests ahead of me, and your song "Goddess for Me" just came back to my thoughts, and thank you for what your music meant to me back then, but what it means to me today now." And it's just like that's still a very short-term example and story, but this girl that my life when she was 10 and 11 impacted her, and she's now going through a hard health battle, sitting in the Mayo Clinic as a 20-year-old, and God's word and the truth of God, who God is, came back to her remembrance because of one of my songs. The truth of God's word in those songs is planted down on the deep inside of them, and it will bear fruit. And that's what I'm here for.
Those stories must be a huge marker for you. I don't know, is that part of how you define success? Is stories like that?
Hearing that always is gonna encourage you. When Dana Key passed away, that he was in DeGarmo and Key, which was a super famous,
Mhm,
80s Christian rock band, still back when blogs were what people were doing, and
mhm.
I remember he passed away, and several people I knew on Facebook all shared this blog post they had written about Dana's impact on their life. And something I found really interesting that I saw was a common thread in these various posts that I was reading was that they said his music, the music of Garmo and Key, shaped their theology. And I think for me, that was another very significant point of me knowing, I've been in the writing rooms at publisher's office. I had never had a conversation with another songwriter as we were writing a song about shaping someone's theology through what we were writing. And I think there's a lot of people in Christian music that that's not their why and their action point behind the song that they're writing. But I thought it was just so cool. And, and if you go and you pull up the DeGarmo and Key Greatest Hits album today, I encourage you to do it. It is specific and it is very bold and it is very black and white what they are singing about, which is why it could shape someone's theology. I know for me, that opened up my mind to just better understand what it was that I was doing of taking biblical truth and chopping it down into the right bite-sized piece for the demographic that I was writing and making that song for.
Speaking of markers of success, you recently won a Dove Award. Congrats, by the way, on
Thank you
that.
very much.
Um, you had already mentioned, you were never signed to a major label. You've been an independent artist. So I think a lot of folks still, even though it's not strange to be a successful, quote unquote, successful independent artist, I think though still people in their minds may have this sense of, well, being an indie artist is kind of like playing in the minor leagues, or
Mhm.
it just has this sense of like being an underdog. Like I'm an underdog. And yet you kind of proved that underdogs can get a Dove Award and play in the major leagues. What did that feel like for you? I mean, after all these years of just doing the grind, making records, being on the road, what was that like for you to
Yeah.
experience that?
The day that I got nominated, I ended up in a puddle of tears, and I will be honest, I've spent my whole life when you're, like, watching the Today Show or you're watching the Tonight Show and some actor is talking about, how it's such an honor to be nominated. I've spent my whole life rolling my eyes and going, "You are full of it." You are full of shiitake because there's no way that it's just such an honor to be nominated. Like, you wanna win. But I totally had to, like, eat my words because I will say when I got nominated, it was a ton of emotions, but I also was like, "Oh my gosh, like, it is such an honor to be nominated." And I think because I also very much prepared myself not to win, I very much was just to be nominated and make it this far, like, truly is an honor. And so I had to, secretly apologize to all those celebrities for the past decades of their interviews where I just thought they were lying through their teeth about that. I think the other sweet thing, if I circle back to that A&R guy in particular, that when the President label head didn't sign me, that I was like, I don't get to be friends with him anymore. Like even just having him say like, it was so fun to get to vote for you. Like I think there was a lot of, oh my goodness, that means so much just hearing from other artists or people within the industry that are voting that would send me a message and tell me like, I listened to all the options and still I thought yours was best. Obviously, that was very encouraging and meant a lot. But I think when I won, I was very much in shock. I think it took me quite a few days or even beyond to like truly let it sink in. My motive for wanting to win was that I hoped that me winning would just be a shared win for the independent artists community
Mhm.
because I know how you often feel very much overlooked and you don't have the radio and you don't have some of these things where it feels like people are just bending over backwards to like highlight certain artist careers and you're out here just working hard and
Mm.
get the backhanded compliment at the end of your show that like, "Oh, that was better than I expected. I should have advertised more," or all of these things that I've gotten for years where it's just like, "Oh, wow, like, you're actually really good. Thanks." Um, and so I hoped that I would win just because I wanted it to be, an adrenaline shot to independent artists that it's just like, you can do this and it is possible. The project in itself that I won the Dove for, Ready, Set, Go, it had been this huge journey of actually it started with some forgiveness, and then it started with revelation from God about Noah's obedience and about how my obedience mattered, and it led to this journey and walk of faith of starting the project when I didn't have every dollar in the bank that I knew I needed to do it, but knew God was asking me to, and just the provision of having all the funds I needed literally like 2 weeks before COVID struck, and being able to then release that music and do some licensing deals that year during COVID when I wasn't playing shows, like, all of these things, like, God revealed to me, like, "Yancey, this was your arc." And so, of all the things that I've ever done, for that project in particular to be the thing that finally ushered me into being nominated and being able to win the category truly just felt like God throwing confetti down from heaven in my honor to say, like, "You weren't asking for this and you weren't seeking it out." Because honestly, as an indie artist, I had submitted things in the past that didn't make it through, to the nomination point and whatever, and so I very much was not making music in order to gain a Dove Award at this point. I was just doing the things I needed to do, and so for it to be the thing that, like, somehow secretly creeped in and won just literally felt like the cherry on top of what was already an amazing story and experience for God to allow for that particular project to win. And so that was certainly super special, and I think also showed me it was a buried dream in my heart, like, it was the teenage dream
Mm,
of Yancey to
mhm.
have that Dove Award in hand. And so for 41-year-old Yancey, I wasn't in it for that anymore, but to still have him give that to me and for you to realize, like, that was a dream in my heart. And as my mom now says after the first time someone introduced me as Dove Award winning Yancey, she was like, "That never goes away. Like, that never can be taken from me or changes from this point in the journey that I was a Dove Award winning artist." At the end of the day, it all comes down to what is God asking you to do, and whether one person hears that or 10 people hears it or millions of people hear it or some other number in between, the quantity isn't what matters, it's your own personal act of obedience to the Lord.
If you could sit down with and give advice to the 25 years ago artist Yancey, what would you say to her?
I would say it's gonna look different than you dreamed it would, but it's gonna be sweeter. Yeah. It's like I'm ultimately doing the same thing that I, as a kid, as a teenager, wanted to do, but the journey has been so much different than what I would have predicted. Yeah. Listen to his voice and it's gonna be a very, very sweet journey.
Well, Yancey, you're such a gift, and it's been so good to hang with you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for just taking the time and sharing your heart with us today.
You bet. It's been my pleasure. Thank y'all for listening.
Thank you so much for watching and for listening to this episode. I loved this episode. She and I have talked since about doing another part two episode where we could get the second half of the story. Yancey had so much life, so much ministry, so much industry stuff since she won another Dove Award and was nominated again. So stay tuned for that. And also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button so you can get every episode moving forward. And if you're listening on audio like Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts, would you please consider leaving a review? And I mean, maybe if you love this as much as I do, you could drop 5 stars. That really helps this get to the people that it needs to get to. So I really, really appreciate it in advance and looking forward to seeing you on an upcoming episode.